We might have called him John Gutenberg. It was Johann, of course, for he was German, and he was one of the most influential men who ever existed. His invention he called artificial writing. We know it as printing. It was done on a machine Gutenberg adapted from a wine press, and probably looked something like this. But there was more to his invention. Movable type, an idea previously invented by the Chinese. But because there were literally thousands of characters in their language, it was of little use and quickly abandoned in favor of carved wood blocks. But it worked perfectly for Gutenberg, for he had only 23 basic letters to deal with. That's how many there were in the Roman alphabet. And he did more than just recycle the Chinese idea. He invented a little gizmo, a mold which could turn out metal types that were exactly the same height. And so, when the type was assembled and inked and pressed against paper, the result was clean, uniform, and highly readable. It was every bit as good as manuscript writing, but a lot faster. You might produce 100 copies of a page in the time it took a scribe to make 1 or 2. This is Gutenberg's first edition, here at the University of Texas in Austin. Gutenberg only printed the black letters. The colored accents, called rubrications, were added by others, as well as the elaborate borders, referred to as illuminations. It's an incredibly beautiful work, and it's easy to see why it gave the people in the manuscript business fits. Well, one would have thought this revolutionary new invention would have made Gutenberg a wealthy man. Unfortunately, the father of printing was more a craftsman than a businessman. Forced into bankruptcy, he died blind and penniless. But others kept the great presses turning, and artificial writing soon spread throughout the continent. At first, everyone was delighted. After all, books and pamphlets were now much more affordable. But remember, only a few people could read, just the scholars and the churchmen and some of the nobility. In other words, the wealthy. So to the average Joe, printing was just ink on paper. And that's the way they wanted it. They didn't want the average Joe to start reading the scriptures. What if Joe began to interpret them? What if he found something there that contradicted the official teachings, one of which said it was God's will that the poor remain poor and the rich get richer? Why, this might lead to revolutions. Well, it wasn't long before some brave souls started to translate the Bible into common languages. People began to read them and question what those in power had been telling them for years. Little pamphlets critical of the government or the church or the rulers began to appear. And as you might guess, this made the rulers very uncomfortable. Suddenly, the printer was someone to be feared. He could be dangerous and had to be controlled. This little park in a noisy London business district is one of the bloodiest spots in all of England. In the old days, it was known as Tower Hill because it was located just a stone's throw from the Tower of London, the famous fortress and dungeon built here 1,000 years ago. It was here on this spot that the condemned were brought out from the tower and publicly executed. People would turn out by the thousands to see it. In those days, there were no TV shows or video arcades, so Execution Day was like a public holiday. Promoters bought up seats and sold them to the spectators, the price depending on the seat location and who the star attraction was to be, sort of like rock concerts today. Many of those executed were thieves and murderers. Others were political prisoners who confessed under torture. Many were printers who used the powerful instrument, the press, to express unpopular opinions. One such man was John Twynne, the most popular printer in London. He'd dared to print a pamphlet that was critical of the court system of the day, and for this he had to die a traitor's death. Most people simply got the axe, but not traitors like Printer John. His sentence was to be hung, carried out not like today with a quick break to the neck, but a slow strangulation that might last 30 minutes or so. And then Printer John was lowered to the ground and, still living, hacked to pieces. His body parts were stuck up on spikes around the city of London as a warning to other printers who might express an unpopular opinion in print. John Twynne had dared to criticize the judges. 2 other printers had their hands cut off because they printed a rumor that Queen Elizabeth I might be getting married. But most of the violations had to do with statements regarding religion. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the world's largest house of worship. To pay for it, Pope Julius sold indulgences, forgivenesses for sins often paid in advance. One who took exception to this was Martin Luther, a German priest who broke with his church over this and other issues. Tradition tells us he hammered his words of protest onto the door of Wittenberg Cathedral in 1517. If so, they wouldn't have stayed up there very long. We do know that a copy fell into the hands of a printer, and it wasn't long before Luther's ideas were being read and debated by people all over Europe. With each turn of the spindle, the pamphlets of protest electrified the Western world and ignited the Protestant Reformation. It raged for centuries, its fires fed by the blood of martyrs, both Catholic and Protestant alike, and by ink from the press. Purges and persecutions rocked the continent. The Inquisition, witch trials, peasant revolts. Even today, in some parts of the world, the conflict is not totally resolved. When the dust settled, there was no longer just one church, but many. More important, religious freedom had been established as a basic human right. The Catholic Church survived, and it might be argued that the Reformation actually saved it, because it became less political and more spiritual. And Pope Julius's dream of a new St. Peter's became a reality as well. It took 200 years to build, is almost as tall as the Great Pyramid, and is filled with some of the world's most famous masterpieces. The story is told of a tourist who was being shown around St. Peter's by an old priest. After the tour, the tourist asked, "How much must all this have cost?" The old priest replied sadly, "It cost the Reformation." And so it did. But without the printer, it might not have happened. When Gutenberg invented printing around 1450, the world was a strange place indeed. Common folk believed it was flat. Sailors thought there were sea monsters in the far oceans, and maps of the time included such locations as the Garden of Eden, and included drawings of curious beast men who were thought to inhabit the unknown territories. One man, studying the ancient Greek maps and atlases, came to believe that the world was round and that you might sail west and end up in China. He was right, but he grossly miscalculated the size of the earth. Had Columbus known its true circumference, he'd never have set out on his historic voyage. But he did, of course, and bumped into America. His was the age of discovery. Aided by the printing of new atlases, other sea captains set out in search of trade routes. Within 50 years of Columbus's landfall, the earth was still a strange place, for truth proved stranger than myth, and the Europeans yearned to learn more of the curious lands, peoples, creatures, and customs they never knew existed. Others were drawn not by curiosity, but by greed. They were called the conquistadors, and they came in search of gold and glory, offering first friendship, then death. For years they were celebrated as heroes, Cortez in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru. Today they stand accused as villains who came murdering and destroying. The new barbarians, the educated ones. Their victims, many of them, were no less savage.
The Aztecs, the Mayas, and others practiced human sacrifice and even cannibalism. The Inca rulers maintained a class society where a nation of poor served a handful of rich. Slavery, too, was very much a part of many pre-Columbian cultures. There was no shortage of villains among the conquerors or the conquered. It could be argued that the worst sin of the conquistadors was that of the barbarians, the destruction of a culture and its accumulation of knowledge. Remember the Roman bronzes melted down by the barbarian invaders? The art of ancient America met a similar fate. Cortez destroyed the great city of the Aztecs. These ruins in downtown Mexico City are all that remain of the great temple pyramid where human sacrifices once took place. Other, much older civilizations were abandoned long before, and it is from their ruined remains that we get most of our scant knowledge of ancient America. Teotihuacan. Its great pyramids, covered in rubble, were finally excavated in the 20th century. For years, many people assumed they were mountains. And here, deep in the jungles of Chiapas, the Maya based its empire, then abandoned it and moved on. It was a rich heritage, going back before the time of Christ. Yet, within the space of 2 years, most of it was gone. And the history, the books, the literature? Did the ancient Americans have a written body of knowledge? Well, some did. They were called codices, highly developed picture writing, almost all of it put to the torch by the Spanish, who knew only too well that to destroy a civilization, you need only destroy its written record. Well, since there were no printers around, there were very few of the precious manuscripts, and these were burned in public bonfires. But the printer did come. His name was Juan Pablos, this first printer in North America. He arrived in 1539 and set up his press in Mexico City. He printed religious materials for the Spanish friars come to convert the Indians. Other printers followed, and Mexico became a printing center. It would be 100 years, though, before printing reached what is now the United States. This was Jamestown, the first English settlement in the New World, established in 1607. The original Jamestown is out there somewhere, washed away by the James River, but a recreated version dramatizes the harsh life experienced by these first colonists. There was little need for printing. They had enough to do clearing the forests, planting crops, and dealing with harsh winters. It would be 75 years before a printer came to Jamestown, and he was chased away by the governor on orders of the king. They weren't about to have printers like John Twin stirring up things here in Virginia. Elsewhere, though, printers got a warmer reception in New England, New York, and Philadelphia. The first known printing was a one-page oath from around 1638 in Massachusetts. No copy survives, and if you happen to find one, it's worth millions of dollars. But we do have the first book printed in colonial America. This book of Psalms, printed by Matthew Day in 1640. Later came prayer books, almanacs, Bibles, sermons, lesson books, and newspapers, all produced on wooden presses like this one at Williamsburg. Yes, colonial Virginia did finally get a printer, over 100 years after the first settlers arrived. By that time, the New World had grown radically apart from the Old, and the colonial press helped drive the wedge even further. It was a stamp tax on printing paper that first sparked rebellion. A brilliant political essay, attacking in print the institution of kingship, brought to the lips of the common man the whispers of revolution. And Jefferson's eloquent letter of resignation to King George, published throughout the colonies in newspapers and broadsides, astonished the world with the concepts of inalienable rights and self-government. The surrender of the British at Yorktown signaled not just an end to the war, but the dawn of a new era in world government. an era in which printers, Isaiah Thomas, Robert Aitken, Benjamin Franklin, and scores of others took leading roles. Other revolutions followed. The French Revolution established the concept of fundamental rights for all people, a true revolution of ideas. Most of these were proclaimed and debated through the printing press, in newspapers, posters, and pamphlets. The press was now a powerful instrument for change. This novel by a New England housewife became an international bestseller and swayed public opinion against the institution of slavery. A shy professor's science book sparked a controversy over evolution that still rages. A book on astronomy by Galileo condemned him to the Inquisition, but also brought about a new understanding of our universe. So now there are whole buildings full of knowledge and ideas, such as here at the Library of Congress. More than any one person could possibly absorb or remember. It's no longer necessary to reinvent or rediscover. It's all here, this great harvest of human wisdom, growing by the day. Miles of bookshelves, millions of volumes, billions of ideas. More than that even, the very pages of history, yesterday's newspapers and magazines containing eyewitness accounts of some of the greatest moments in human history as they were recorded for the very first time. Here, a forgotten brawl in a saloon on the western frontier, or a skirmish between colonists and Indian tribes that occurred early in America's infancy. Classified ads from another time enable us to capture the flavor of life as it was lived long ago. Of course, we haven't always had newspapers and periodicals. Gutenberg never printed a newspaper. He never even read one, because they hadn't been invented yet. There was just word of mouth, or the legendary town crier to spread the news. Then printers started selling little booklets called news books, which dealt with one single event. Later, they started to print several stories in the same issue. And finally, true news sheets, the first newspapers in the modern sense, were born. This is where the first newspaper publishers first set up their shops, at the wharf. When the ships would come in, the printer would rush out to meet them and interview the captain and the crew to find out what was happening in America or Europe or elsewhere. And then he would publish those reports in his news sheets. Of course, since the ships might be out of port for as long as several years, the news was oftentimes somewhat out of date. But without the telephone, telegraph, and mass transportation, that was about the best they could hope for. Later, as newspapers became more common, printers in America quit relying so much on the reports of sailors. They would simply reprint stories from the English and European papers as they arrived at port. But the American newspaper printers were not just copycats. They broke new ground insofar as freedom of the press was concerned. For years, printers who were thought to promote dangerous ideas might have their presses burned or themselves publicly flogged. In 1735, a printer named John Peter Zenger tested this tradition when he dared to criticize New York's corrupt Governor Cosby in his newspaper. Zenger was thrown into jail, later to be hauled up before a kangaroo court. But his lawyer was so persuasive, he actually convinced the stacked jury to set Zenger free. For the first time, the idea of press censorship had been attacked. Freedom of the press soon became a reality, leading, as we've seen, to the American Revolution. After independence, newspapers became more popular than ever. The telegraph made it quicker and easier to gather the news from across the continent. Faster steamships and clipper ships reduced transatlantic crossings so foreign news could be picked up more quickly. Daniel Craig, a printer's apprentice, came up with the idea of sailing out to meet the ships offshore and sending back news summaries by carrier pigeon, thereby scooping the competition. Nothing impacted newspapers like the Civil War. People were desperate for news, and for the first time there were full-time professional reporters and journalists. Illustrated newspapers, like the great Harper's Weekly, brought the war into homes across America, with eyewitness sketches transformed into wood engravings. Other new technologies increased the demand for printing, and particularly newspapers. The light bulb, for example. People were suddenly reading more because they had more light to read by in their leisure hours. The telephone in 1877 greatly improved the gathering of news. The typewriter reduced the time necessary to prepare it for publication. Then came photography. At first, editors redrew the photographs as artists' illustrations. But then, using a system of tiny dots, printers created the halftone, and photos became as important as words in the pages of the newspaper. The political cartoon entered its golden age. Harper's hired the legendary Thomas Nast, who used humor to attack corruption in government. Along the way, he created the Democratic donkey, the Republican elephant, Uncle Sam, and our modern visualization of Santa Claus. Around 1890, the New York World started to print in color. Yellow was particularly hard to reproduce, so to show off, the newspaper introduced a rather ugly character called the Yellow Kid, who became the first comic strip hero. Later, strips were reprinted and sold separately, giving rise to the comic book industry. Not only was the news gathered more quickly, but it was being printed faster too. Higher-speed newspaper presses were developed. Still, a lot of time was lost just setting the type, which was done by hand, much as Gutenberg had done it 4 centuries before. So, in 1887, Otmar Mergenthaler invented the linotype machine, which cast letters on the spot and arranged them for printing at the command of a keyboard operator. It is considered one of the greatest inventions of all time, transforming not just the newspaper, but the entire printing industry, and was in use for 100 years. Other innovations followed. William Morris, called the father of modern printing, saw print as not just ink on paper, but a thing of beauty in its own right. Printers suddenly became concerned about quality. Typefaces became more elegant. Images became sharper. Color printing got better and better.
Competing communications technologies arose. Radio, television. They only enlarged our methods of communications, and printing continued to grow. Computers came along, and some people said Gutenberg was a has-been. We'd soon have a world without print. It didn't happen. In some cases, such as legal encyclopedias, they moved from print to computer screens. But by and large, books and magazines, newspapers, manuals, packaging, all continued to mushroom. In fact, desktop publishing has made printing more affordable and more exciting. Gone are cameras, light tables, and film. Using computers, today's printer can do complex layouts in a matter of minutes, change colors, and manipulate images. So the last laugh still belongs to Gutenberg. Though the technologies have changed, printing continues to preserve the past, record the present, and help invent the future. More than that, Gutenberg's invention has made knowledge the property of every man and every woman. Well, not quite. Unfortunately, this great treasury of knowledge is available only to those people who can read, and a disturbing trend is that more and more people cannot. Just as in Roman times, or in the Dark Ages, when the rich and the powerful were those who were literate, well, the same holds true today. The scientists, the politicians, the inventors, the doctors and lawyers and sports writers and bosses continue to be those people who can read. It's always been so, yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
What of tomorrow? Will it too be a communications age, even as we look beyond the bounds of Earth and reach for the stars? Undoubtedly so. It began with Pioneer 10, threading its way through the solar system, telling us more about our universe than we'd ever known before. Then the satellite took leave of Jupiter to plunge into deep space. Her transmitters would soon be extinguished, but the relic satellite would continue on. For a decade, it had sent its messages of discovery back to Earth, but no more. For the next billion years, it would seek only to communicate with alien beings somewhere in the stars. On its nose cone was a message. It told of the Earth and our solar system. It described the human men and women who lived here. It was a message in a bottle, hurled into an ocean of stars.
It's written in a language as old as communications itself, picture writing, not unlike the ancient pictoglyphs carved here on the walls of these canyons. Will Pioneer's message ever be received? And if so, will its meaning be understood? Or will it be as garbled and confusing as these symbols?
There's another irony. Pioneer's next port of call is an obscure star called Ross 248, somewhere in the constellation Andromeda. There may be planets and life forms that might intercept the satellite and its cryptic message from Earth. Estimated time of arrival, about 35,000 years from now.
An incredible amount of time? Perhaps. But perhaps not. For that's just about the number of years that have passed since our long-ago ancestors inscribed on cave walls those first primitive efforts to communicate with the future.